I was staring at my calendar this morning and I landed on February 6th. And let's be honest, usually that date is it's just there. It's a Tuesday, maybe a Thursday.
Right, it's the definition of a random square on the wall.
It really is. It's gray, it's cold. It feels like a filler episode in the season of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But then I started digging into the research you sent over for this deep dive, and I realized I was completely wrong. This date isn't filler at all. It's like a high voltage wire.
It is. It's one of those rare days where the timeline seems to fold in on itself. You pull on one thread, February 6th, and the whole tapestry of the 20th century just comes with it.
We are talking about a single date that anchors the official start of the American Empire, the rebranding of the British monarchy,
The architect of the modern war on drugs, and the birth of probably the biggest countercultural icon of the century.
and we can't forget the death of a tennis legend who just fundamentally changed how we talk about health and vulnerability.
It is all happening on February 6th.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to trace what the sources are calling the unbroken chain. We're covering 94 years, 1899 to 1993. And I have to be honest, when I first saw the list of characters, a treaty, a queen, a president, a reggae star, and a tennis player, I thought, okay, this is the weirdest dinner party in history.
It is a chaotic dinner party, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But the fascinating thing is, they're all speaking to each other. They're answering each other across the decades.
Before we jump into the timeline, though, the research introduces a specific framework. It's called Sankofa. Can you break that down? Because I think it's going to be our compass for this whole thing.
Absolutely. Sankofa is an Akan concept from West Africa, from the people of Ghana. And it's often symbolized by a bird that's flying forward, but its head is turned backward,
Looking back.
looking back, and it's holding an egg in its mouth. The literal translation is go back and fetch it.
Go back and fetch it. I love that imagery. It's so active.
It is very active. And it's vital for us today because Sankofa isn't about nostalgia. It's not about, thinking things were better back in the day.
Right.
It's about understanding that the past is active. It is alive. The events we're going to talk about today, things from 1899 or 1952, they aren't dead history. They're the operating system for 2026.
So we're not just reciting dates for trivia night. We're going back to fetch the context to understand why our world looks the way it does right now.
Exactly. We have to fetch the egg, the knowledge, to move forward safely.
Okay, let's grab the first link in this chain. We're going back to February 6th, 1899, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Senate chamber. And the vibe, according to these transcripts, is incredibly tense.
Extremely tense. The Senate is about to ratify the Treaty of Paris. This is the document that officially ends the Spanish-American War.
Now, usually when we learn about this in school, it's framed as a liberation moment. The U.S. helped Cuba get freedom from Spain. But the sources paint a much more transactional picture.
It was a straight-up real estate deal.
Mm-hmm.
The most important part of this treaty wasn't the peace, it was the purchase.
The purchase.
On this day, February 6th, the United States paid Spain $20 million. And for that $20 million, they bought the Philippines. They also acquired Puerto Rico and Guam.
Wow, we literally have the receipt. $20 million for millions of people.
But here's the nugget that really matters for our unbroken chain. It's not just that the U.S. bought land. It's that on this day, the U.S. had to decide, what are we? Are we a republic or are we an empire?
Because up until then, the logic was westward expansion. You take land like Ohio or Montana and it eventually becomes a state. The people there become citizens. That was the deal.
Right. That was the model. But 1899 breaks that model completely. The Senate looked at the Philippines and Puerto Rico and said, we want the land, the naval bases, the resources, but we do not want these people as fellow citizens.
And this leads to a legal concept that I found, well, honestly, a little terrifying, the insular cases.
Yes. The Supreme Court and the Senate had to do some serious legal gymnastics to justify this. They came up with a concept of territorial possession without incorporation.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means these places belong to the United States, but they are not part of the United States.
Foreign in a domestic sense. That's the phrase that jumped out at me.
That's the exact phrase. And we have to be blunt about why. The Senate debates from 1899 are shocking to read today. They weren't hiding it. They explicitly debated whether alien races could understand Anglo-Saxon justice.
Wow.
They argued that these populations were unfit and couldn't be given the full protection of the Constitution.
So they created a legal limbo, a category of people who are subjects but not citizens.
Precisely.
And this isn't just ancient history. This is the software that is still running Puerto Rico today, right? This is the Sankofa moment.
100%.
Yeah.
If you look at 2026, You have 3 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico who can be drafted into the military.
They can be sent to die for the U.S.
Right. But they cannot vote for the commander-in-chief who sends them to war. They have no voting representation in Congress. That democratic deficit was architected on February 6, 1899.
So the debates we see now about statehood versus independence, we're looking at the direct downstream effects of that vote.
It established a racial hierarchy in American law, that you can own a place and control its people without giving them rights. That's the foundation of the chain.
Okay, so we have the foundation, empire established through law. Now let's jump forward 53 years. Same date, February 6, 1952. We're moving from D.C. to the forests of Kenya.
This is such a cinematic moment, but the reality is much darker. You have Princess Elizabeth, she's 25 years old, staying at the Treetops Hotel in Kenya.
Right, the luxury game viewing lodge built into a giant fig tree.
Exactly. And the famous saying is, she went up the tree a princess and came down a queen.
Because that night, her father, King George VI, died in his sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But the context here is what makes this so critical. It looks like a fairy tale. But what was actually happening in Kenya right outside that hotel?
It was a powder keg. Kenya was a British colony, and the indigenous people were on the verge of the Mau uprising. They were fighting for their land back from British settlers.
So within months of her becoming queen,
Within months, the British government would be declaring a state of emergency and building concentration camps in Kenya to crush that rebellion.
so if 1899 was about the U.S. grabbing territory, 1952 is about the British Empire trying to hold on to it.
Or at least transform how it looked. Exactly. Elizabeth's reign, which begins on this day, covers the era of decolonization. So nations like Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, they all gain their independence. But this is where the chain gets sneaky.
Because the empire didn't just pack up and go home, did it?
No, it rebranded. This is the genius of British soft power. The empire dissolved, but the Commonwealth was born. Elizabeth became the head of the Commonwealth.
And on the surface, that sounds nice. It sounds like a voluntary club of friends.
That's the branding. But look at the mechanics. You had independent African and Caribbean nations where the Queen's face was still on the money. You had legal treaties based on English common law. You had trade deals that kept these new nations economically dependent on Britain.
So it's the difference between political independence, you get a flag, and actual economic independence.
Precisely. It's what scholars call neo-colonialism. And that transition, that pivot from empire to Commonwealth, it starts on February 6th, 1952.
So we have the law of 1899 and the symbolism of 1952. Both are about maintaining hierarchy. Now, we move to the enforcement, and this brings us to a birthday, February 6th, 1911.
Ronald Reagan.
The great communicator. How does he fit into this lineage of empire?
Well, the argument here is fascinating. If 1899 was about governing subject populations abroad, the research argues that Reagan's domestic policies applied a similar logic to Black and brown communities within the U.S.
You're talking about the new empire at home, the war on drugs.
Right. And we need to look at the numbers because they're staggering. Before Reagan takes office in 1980, the U.S. prison population is around 500,000.
Okay.
By the time he leaves office, and in the years immediately following his policies, it skyrockets to over 1 million, eventually hitting 2 million.
That's a massive jump. It's a vertical line on the graph.
And it wasn't an accident. It was policy design. The sources point to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This established the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine.
And just to clarify, chemically, they're almost identical. But crack was prevalent in Black communities. Powder was more for Wall Street and white suburbia.
Exactly. Same drug, different form. But if you got caught with 5 grams of crack, you got a mandatory 5 years. To get that same sentence with powder, you needed 500 grams.
Wow.
It targeted Black communities with surgical precision.
But, and this is the key, he didn't speak like the senators in 1899. He didn't use that kind of explicit racial language.
No, and that's the evolution. He mastered the language of colorblindness. He talked about personal responsibility, states' rights, law and order. It sounds neutral. It sounds American.
But the outcome was the same. The containment and control of a specific population. It's a rebranding, just like the Commonwealth.
Exactly. And his foreign policy followed the same track. Remember what was happening in South Africa during the 80s. Right. A brutal system of racial segregation. And Reagan opposed sanctions against the apartheid regime. He labeled Nelson Mandela's party, the ANC, a terrorist organization.
Why?
Because of the Cold War. The apartheid government was anti-communist, so human rights took a backseat.
That is a heavy chain. It feels solid, unbreakable. But here's where the deep dive takes a turn. February 6th also gives us the key to breaking it.
The pivot point.
We have to talk about the sonic resistance. Born February 6, 1945, Bob Marley.
If the previous events were about control, Marley is entirely about freedom. And I don't mean the, poster in a college dorm room version of Marley.
Right, the peace and love caricature.
We need to erase that. The sources paint him as a radical political educator. I mean, think about his context. He's born in a British colony, Jamaica, just before that 1952 transition.
So he sees the Union Jack flag come down and the Jamaican flag go up.
Exactly. But he realizes that the system, what he called Babylon, didn't actually leave. He saw the poverty, the police brutality. He realized the colonial empire had just been replaced by a neo-colonial economic system.
And his music was a weapon against that. There's a reason the CIA kept a file on him.
He was dangerous to the status quo. In 1976, gunmen broke into his home and shot him, his wife, and his manager just 2 days before a huge peace concert.
And what did he do?
He went on stage 2 days later with the bullet still in his arm and performed.
That is not peace and love. That is defiance.
It is. And his strategy was brilliant. He just bypassed the colonial powers. He went straight to Pan-Africanism. He sings songs like Zimbabwe and Africa Unite.
I read that he actually paid his own way to perform at Zimbabwe's independence celebration in 1980.
He did. He spent his own money. The Rhodesian police actually tear-gassed the crowd outside the stadium during his set because so many people wanted in. And he kept playing. He was saying, "We don't need London. We don't need Washington. We have a deeper connection."
There is one lyric that the sources highlight as the direct answer to the Treaty of Paris. It's from Redemption Song.
Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds.
That hits so hard when you connect it to the legal history we just covered.
It's the ultimate countermove. The empire can buy the land, put its face on the money, build prisons, but Marley is arguing that true liberation starts in the software of the mind.
The software update for the resistance.
You can't arrest a song.
Yeah.
You can't ratify a treaty against a rhythm.
So we have the loud sonic resistance of Marley, but our final link is quieter. It's more personal, but honestly, it might be just as powerful.
February 6, 1993, the death of Arthur Ashe.
Now, Arthur Ashe is a legend, first black man to win Wimbledon. But a tennis player seems like an odd fit in this chain of empire and revolution. He was playing in country clubs.
But you have to look at the space he occupied. Tennis in the 60s and 70s wasn't just a sport. It was the ultimate white space. It was exclusion, a symbol of the very hierarchy we've been talking about.
So just by walking onto the court, he was disrupting the order.
He was infiltrating. And his strategy was very different from Marley's. Ashe was inside the system, proving he could beat them at their own game.
Respectability, code switching.
Exactly. He was cool, calm, collected. He used it as a shield and a sword.
But the end of his life brings this tragic, heroic twist to his resistance, and this connects back to the Reagan era in a very painful way.
It does. Arthur Ashe contracted HIV from a blood transfusion in the 80s. And remember the context. This is the height of the AIDS crisis.
A crisis that the Reagan administration largely ignored.
Ignored and stigmatized. It was treated as a gay plague. The government was silent.
Yeah.
It was another form of othering, deciding which lives matter.
And here comes Arthur Ashe, a global sports icon. And in 1992, he gets a call from a newspaper saying, "We know you have AIDS, and we're running the story."
A total violation. But he took control. He held a press conference. And instead of hiding in shame, he spent the last year of his life until February 6, 1993, advocating for health justice.
He made himself vulnerable in a way black men, especially, were told not to be.
Vulnerability is resistance. That is the lesson. In a world that wanted black men to be invisible, or statistics in the war on drugs, he stood up and said, "I am sick, I am here, and we need to fix this."
He forced the public to look at AIDS differently.
He paved the way for athletes we see today. When you see Simone Biles talk about mental health or Colin Kaepernick take a knee, that is the legacy of Arthur Ashe.
Wow. So look at the contrast. You have the external resistance of Marley changing the culture, and the internal resistance of Ashe changing hearts through vulnerability.
It really is an unbroken chain.
Let's try to pull this all together. It's like a tug of war happening on one square of the calendar. On one side, we have the architects of empire.
Right, 1899. The Treaty of Paris creates the legal framework for owning people, 1952. Queen Elizabeth II represents the symbolic transition that keeps the economic ties, and Reagan enforces those hierarchies with policy.
And on the other side, sharing the exact same calendar date.
You have the resistance. Bob Marley, born on this day, decolonizing the mind. and Arthur Ashe dying on this day, breaking barriers through personal courage.
This is where Sankofa becomes so practical. We're not just looking at a history book, we're looking at the roots of our current headline.
Exactly. If you're reading about Puerto Rico's status today, that's 1899. If you're debating the future of the Commonwealth, that's 1952. If you're looking at criminal justice reform, you are wrestling with the legacy of the 1980s.
And if you are listening to Kendrick Lamar speaking truth to power,
You are tapping into the lineage of Bob Marley.
and if you see athletes taking a stand for social justice,
That is the legacy of Arthur Ashe.
it's incredible. One date, February 6th. It holds the history of both the empire and the resistance.
It forces us to ask a question. The past isn't dead. These two lineages, control and freedom, are still fighting it out today, in our laws, in our culture, in our healthcare.
That is the provocation we want to leave you with. If February 6th represents this tug of war between maintaining hierarchies and breaking them down, which lineage are you actively feeding today?
Are you enforcing the chain or are you breaking it?
Something to think about next time you see that random square on the calendar. It's never just a date. Thanks for diving in with us.
Keep digging.